Okay, here we are in Esther chapter 9. Let's just start right off the bat again. Esther chapter 9, verses 1 through 4. Remember, we're going to finish chapter 9 and 10 sometime in the next couple of weeks. And whatever week we finish the actual text of Esther, the following week will be our miniature Feast of Purim. I know that Tammy for sure is going to make some of the Haman's Pockets pastries for us. And a couple others of you have talked about possibly doing that, so just let me know. We can have a miniature feast, and you can warm up your yaying and your booing, because the way that tradition goes is you read the Esther scroll, and when you hear the name Mordecai, everybody cheers, and when you hear the name Haman, everybody boos. And it's really more fun than it sounds, so it'll be a good time. When we did that in the Young Disciples was the children's program that my parents and my associate pastor led for us when I was in elementary age at our church. We couldn't get one of the official programs to come to our church, so we kind of did our own. But in Young Disciples, we did a Feast of Purim every year, and we had these little ratchety things you swing around like this to make the noise for Mordecai, and then we had these kazoos that kind of had a kind of a miserable buzzing sound, and that was for Haman. It was a great time, you know. So I want to share that joy with you. And we'll do that maybe October 29th, I'm looking at right now. It just depends on how talkative we are today. And remember, we are not in a hurry in Wednesday morning Bible study. So I have to remind myself of that. So anyway, we'll look forward to our Feast of Purim here in a few weeks. Esther 9, verses 1 through 4. Who would start us out this morning on that? Esther 9, verses 1 through 4. Okay, Steve on the front row, please.
So, on March the 7th, the two decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them, but no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces and the highest officers, the governors, and the royal officials helped the Jews for fear of Mordecai. For Mordecai had been promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as he became more and more powerful.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So 13th day, 12th month, that is the same day that both decrees were supposed to come into effect. Remember the way that Daniel and Esther described the Persian Empire. Once a Persian king made a decree, you couldn't change it, so you just had to kind of over-legislate it. And we've laughed at the way that our own country works on that, make a new law to cover up the old law. But anyway, that's what happened. So both these decrees, the decree that said that the enemies of the Jews could attack, kill, and destroy them, and now the decree that the Jews themselves can defend themselves against those who would attack, kill, and destroy them, they both come to bear on the same day. And the key word there in the Hebrew is the word for overturned. Something totally different happened. Your translations may say the tables are turned. We already had a turning of tables on the individual level. Mordecai and Haman had their fates, their destinies, their roles reversed. Mordecai ended up with Haman's role, Haman's power, Haman's ring, Haman's clothes, all this. And Haman ended up with Mordecai's execution. And so all that, and of course Mordecai ended up with Haman's parade too. So all that has happened, that reversal has happened. And now we're emphasizing the reversal on the larger level. And the Jews get the upper hand over their enemies because all the powers that be, as it turns out, are helping them, it seems, because they are afraid of the Jews, and more specifically, they are afraid of Mordecai, who has gained some prominence. A couple things I wanted to highlight here. One is the land, the phrasing in the Hebrew is that the enemies of the Jews couldn't stand against them. This language of standing and falling has been a big deal throughout Esther. So you may remember that Haman fell before Esther, and Esther fell before the king. And you may remember that Haman's wife said, if this guy Mordecai is Jewish, you're going to fall before him. And so who's going to stand and who's going to fall has been this implicit question throughout the book of Esther, just by the way the author chooses to word things, standing and falling. And so now we find that the enemies of the Jews are unable to stand against them. And the other thing I wanted to highlight here is the rise of Mordecai. We just barely scratched the surface of this last week, but I want to talk about the implications of this. Fear of Mordecai had seized them. Go back to chapter 5, verse 9, if you would, please. Esther 5, verse 9. Who would like to read that today? Norm has it. Esther 5, verse 9.
Haman went out that day happy and in a high spirit. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai.
Okay, so Mordecai refused to fear Haman back in chapter 9. By the way, when Haman was in high spirits, it means he was drunk. That's how we translate that. He was, he was full. That's exactly right, Bill. He was full of the spirits for sure. And that same phrase has happened actually a couple of times in Esther. Sometimes in our English translations we clean stuff up a little bit, but he was drunk. Anyway, so Haman goes out from banquet number 1, and he was drunk, and he was enraged that Mordecai would not show fear in his presence. And now we have a turning of tables. Mordecai, who would not fear Haman, now has the fear of all the king's horses and all the king's men, so to speak. Like all of the royal officials have this high regard for Mordecai. The language used of Mordecai in chapter 9, when we read that these satraps and governors and nobles and royal officials had a fear of him, is very similar, actually, to the language used of both Moses and Joshua. And we saw here in Esther chapter 9 that the corporate fear of the Jews on the large scale, and the individual fear, regard of Mordecai, go together. And the same thing happens actually with both Moses and Joshua. So let's go back and look at that. Let's go to Exodus first. Exodus 11:3 first here. Exodus 11:3. I'm still chuckling about Bill's comment. He was full of spirits. That's good. That's good. Haman was full of spirits. Exodus 11:3. Bill, you want that?
The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by the people. Okay, so there you see that the Egyptians have this favor toward the people of Israel on the whole, and also for Moses particularly. And who is responsible for giving the Egyptian people this regard for Moses and the people of Israel? Who has given them this disposition? The beginning of the verse there that Bill read, 11:3. The Lord has done this. So we have a theological explanation. So remember, in Esther, we don't get much theology explicitly. The name of God is not in there, but it's sometimes the way the author of Esther phrases things. He wants us to hear other echoes, and so we're going to infer that the reason that Mordecai and the Jewish people are enjoying the fear of the Persians right now in Esther 9 is because the Lord has done something. That's the same thing that happened for the people of Israel in the days of the Exodus. Let's go on to Exodus 15. This is the song after they come through the sea. Exodus 15, and we're going to begin reading in verse 14, if I can type it in. Exodus 15, and let's do 14 through 16. How about that? Who would like that? Jeff, I saw first. Exodus 15, verses 14 through 16.
The people shall hear and be afraid. Sorrow shall take hold on the inhabitants of Palestine, and the dukes of Edom shall be amazed. The mighty men of Moab, trembling, shall take hold upon themselves, and all the inhabitants of Canaan shall melt away. Fear and dread shall fall upon them. By the greatness of thine arm, they shall be as still as a stone. Till thy people pass over, O Lord, till the people pass over which thou hast purged.
Okay, thank you. And just to clarify that, verse 15, how did it refer to the people from Edom in your translation?
The dukes of Edom.
The Dukes of Edom. I know. That's how I'm thinking, the Dukes of Hazzard. He says the Dukes of Edom. So, that sounds like the name of a band or something. Some garage band, the Dukes of Edom. Anyway, Edom, by the way, is not reflected on positively usually in the Old Testament, so you probably don't want to name. Maybe if there's some annoying neighborhood pests, like a bunch of raccoons in your yard,
you can call them the Dukes of Edom. But that's great. The King James Version comes through again for us there. But notice, basically all these people everywhere that the people of Israel are going to encounter are going to fear and tremble before them. And again, the theological explanation is the power of Yahweh's arm, which has just brought them through the Red Sea. So you have this fear of Moses back in chapter 11, and now the fear of the people again, and this fear is coming because Yahweh their God has acted on their behalf, and we are going to hold them in high regard now. Before we talk about this concept a bit more, let's go to Joshua. Joshua chapter 2, and I want to read more than what's on the board there because I realize that it's an incomplete fragment. Joshua chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. This is Rahab, the prostitute turned assistant to the Israelite invasion. Joshua 2, verses 8 through 11. This is in Jericho now. Go for it, John. Thank you.
Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us. But all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above, on the earth below.
Okay, thank you, John. So Rahab is basically telling us why it is she has assisted the Israelite spies who have snuck into Jericho, and she has been hiding them from the people trying to search them out. And she's helping them because fear of you has fallen upon us. So our official people might be against you, but we in general are afraid of you because of what the Lord has done for you. Same concept again. Now Joshua chapter 6. Joshua chapter 6, verse 27, I think. Joshua chapter 6, verse 27. Who would like this? Sherry gets it. The shortest reading of the day, I think. Go for it. Joshua 6:27.
So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land.
Okay, the Lord was with Joshua, so he is famous because of the Lord. So this is, again, one of those things where the author of Esther, for whatever reason, doesn't bring God explicitly into the story, but the language you go back and read now in chapter 9 of Esther, you say that's Moses' language, that's Joshua language, that's people of God feared by the other peoples because of Yahweh type of language. And so he is implying for us that that's what's going on here. Any questions or impressions about that line of thinking?
Don't we often see, even in the church today, we're Christians, we don't necessarily have to hit people over the head with our faith in Jesus Christ, but by acting out our faith,
Yeah.
we can have a great impression upon them, but just by acting out.
Yes, so Bill is saying by living out our faith, and what God does through us becomes a testimony, a witness to those around us. I thought about that closing song that we did on Sunday. So Sunday's sermon was about trusting the God of abundance, and so the closing hymn was "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus." And there's that line in there, how I've proved him over and over, which I don't love the syntax of that because I really haven't proved him. He's proven himself through me, but you get the point. It has to fit the rhythm of the song, so you have to change things sometimes. But anyway, that's the thought of that song, is that just by living out faith in the living God, and he has shown himself through me, he has proven himself faithful in my life, in our lives, and so we get to be witnesses in that sense. And that the other side of that, though, is if there is anything about us that is awe-inspiring or whatever, it's the Lord working through us. It's him doing his stuff. So an opportunity to say, Lord, do your work through me to your glory, And I think that's a great point, yeah, for sure. Other questions, comments about? Yes, Karen.
I agree with everything that was said, and I believe that. But the world as a whole does not fear God.
No, that's right, sure.
But I think one of these days,
Yeah, sure. The world as a whole doesn't fear God. One of these days they will. Every knee shall bow, every tongue confess, willingly or reluctantly, right? So all the more need for a people who live like Mordecai and Esther, which really is a radical trust in the Lord. There's some significant risk-taking
that Mordecai and Esther engage in, chapters 4 and 5, because of, again implied, not stated, because of their faith in Yahweh, the God of Israel. And then he shows himself faithful to his glory, and you have this evangelistic effect. So a world that does not fear God actually desperately needs a community of people who do fear God and become conduits through which he can do his work, and then people see through us. Now we're back to Revelation. Remember, in Revelation, the plagues themselves were not sufficient to bring the transformation. They were of the same style of the plagues in the book of Exodus, in the sense that it was supposed to bring a changing of heart for Pharaoh and for his people. But the plagues themselves were not sufficient. But when you combine the plagues with the work of the faithful witnesses who share in the circumstance of Christ, the shame, the death, and then the resurrection, the vindication, when the world sees the vindication of God's faithful witnesses, that has that evangelistic effect, and now we're going to fear God and give him glory. So we see a world that does not know or fear God, and we say we want to live like Mordecai and Esther and Joshua and Moses and the rest, so that God's work is shown through us, and that becomes an evangelistic thing. That becomes an awe-inspiring thing, not because of our own glory, but because of God and his work through us. So, beautiful thing about God, by the way, that he chooses to do his work through us. He could do everything unilaterally, but he likes to work through his people. He likes to work through Moses, through Joshua, through Esther, through Mordecai, through you and me. That's a neat thing. Yes?
My favorite stories, like Voice of Martyrs, or Saul Paul, like times when persecutors are turned because they see Jesus, they see people forgiving them, or loving, or living in a way they would not expect someone to live, who's in prison or
Yeah.
being tortured or whatever.
Yeah. So Liz is saying some of her favorite stories in Voice of the Martyrs, and some of this goes back to the Apostle Paul. This life transformation stuff, and when people start living and forgiving. I mean, the Voice of the Martyrs, there's all kinds of stories in there about Christians who personally or their own family and friends have been killed, imprisoned, wronged, whatever, because of their faith. And then when they have forgiven, the enemies don't know what to do with that. So when we think about the power of God working through us and being a witness, it's not just through the parting of the Red Sea or the walls of Jericho fell or the overthrow of Haman here. It's also through simple acts like you and I forgive the person who doesn't deserve forgiveness. We show acts of kindness to the person who's not been kind to us. We are generous in an uncommon way when no one else would expect it. When Christians embody the power of God in those ways, that catches the fear and awe as well. When I know that I deserved wrath from you and I got kindness instead, that is a humbling thing. That's an awe-inspiring thing. And so we have an opportunity to live into that. Yes, Bill?
The other night when the Taylor University crowd was here, one of the songs was the conversion song.
Yeah,
I couldn't understand the words it was.
right.
But the first part of the song had a great deal of obvious conflict in it.
Yeah,
They were kind of back and forth, and it sounded very angry and everything. Then all of a sudden it changed and became
yeah,
soft and melodious and everything. And I thought, Saul's life before Jesus came to him was one of conflict and discourse and fighting and everything.
right.
Basically with the Holy Spirit working in his life.
Sure.
And then once he accepted Jesus Christ, his entire life changed.
Yes, yeah,
And we can be much the same way. And so I didn't have to understand the words that they were saying, just the basic content of the song,
Yeah.
the way it was presented, showed to me what actually happened in
sure.
Saul's life.
So Bill is sharing that when the Taylor Chorale and Sounds were here, one of their numbers was a song about the conversion of Saul, and the words were hard to understand. Some of them may have been Latin, I don't even know. But they were, you couldn't tell the words, but you could tell the flow. Like there was a change in the music to represent the change in life. As you were sharing that, Bill, I was thinking about the man that Jesus cast out the legion of demons, and the awe-inspiring experience there was this man who was crazy, out of control, and naked, and living in the graveyard, and all that sort of stuff. Now he's clothed and sober and sitting in his right mind, and that was awe-inspiring, I think about the wind and the waves obey him, and that was awe-inspiring. So sometimes it's the strange calm and peace where there was no calm and peace becomes a testimony to what God has done. So again, here we have whispers, that this is Yahweh, the God of Israel, that has caused this fear of Mordecai and fear of the Jews to fall upon the leaders and the people in Persia, and is causing, at least for the leaders and peoples who are not enemies of the Jews, they have decided very much now they are friends of the Jews, and they're going to assist the Jews in their day of defense on the 13th day of the 12th month because of this fear of Mordecai. Are we ready for verse 5? All right, let's read Esther 9, verses 5 through 10. This has lots of fun Hebrew names in it, fun Persian names, actually. So Jeff will get this one for us. If you don't know how to pronounce the name, just nail it with confidence, and we'll all nod along. It'll be a good thing. Esther 9, verses 5 through 10, please, Jeff.
Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would to those that hated them. And at Shushan, the palace, the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. And Parshandatha, and Dalphon, and Aspatha, and Poratha, and Adaliah, Ariditha, Harmashda, and Arisai, and Ariday, and Jezebel. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Amminadab, and the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but on the spoil laid they not their hand.
All right, I love those names. Adalia sounds like a town in Illinois or something, doesn't it? Anyway, what'd you say? Or an onion. Adalia. That's good. Adalia onion. Very good. All right. Anyway, so the Jews strike down their enemies, killing and destroying them. So 3 verbs there: strike down, or in Jeff's translation, smote. I like that. They smote them. Smote, killed, destroyed. Not the exact 3 terms at each point, but again, we had the 3 terms before, back in chapter 13, what the enemies were authorized to do, and then in chapter 11, what the Jews were authorized to do in advance. 3 verbs in each case, and we have, I think, 1 or 2 of the 3 are the same here, but we get the idea by the threefold repetition. They struck down, they killed, they destroyed. They went after their enemies. Notice the target audience in verse 5 is their enemies and those who hated them. This is not an indiscriminate slaughter of any random people in Persia. The target is those who were presenting an active threat to them. In the citadel of Susa there in verse 6, or the fortress, or the Acropolis, that'd be a Greek term used anachronistically, but in what we're talking about is the government complex within the overall city. So you have the citadel, and then outside that you have the city. I have not made much of the distinction of this throughout Esther, but we probably need to do a little bit with it right now. The difference between what happens in the citadel, the government fortress complex center where the palace is located, versus what happens in the surrounding city. So the citadel of Susa, back in chapter 1, that is where the king has his lengthy feast, and that is where Vashti's disobedience happens. Chapter 2, the citadel, is where the women from throughout the empire are brought in to be assembled for the king's pleasure contest, if you will, to see who's going to be the new king. Chapter 3, though, let's read that one, Esther 3:15, because the word for citadel and the word for city are both in that verse. Esther 3:15. Who would like to read that? Esther 3:15. All right, Todd has it. Thank you. Esther 3:15.
Orders went quickly by order of the king, and a decree was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown in confusion. Okay, so we have the king's command issued from the citadel of Susa, and then we read from the context it goes out by these writers on the circuit, the mail system. The news goes out. But then the city is bewildered, is puzzled, is perplexed by this. So there you have your clearest contrast between what happens in the citadel, this rather thoughtless decree, especially from the standpoint of the king, to go out and wipe out these Jews, goes out from the citadel, but the city is puzzled by this. So you get the idea there's a town-gown disconnect, if you will, between what's happening in the palace and what's happening around. Then we read more about the city. In chapter 4, Mordecai goes out into the city. He leaves the citadel for the city for his public mourning, and that's where Esther's messenger back and forth has to find him and talk to him. Remember, the king doesn't want anybody in sackcloth inside the palace. No sadness in here, only drinking, right? If you're going to be sad, you go outside of the walls. So Mordecai is publicly mourning in the city. And then in chapter 6, what happens in the city is Haman parades Mordecai through the city saying,
this is the man the king delights to honor. You know, the parade he had planned for himself and turned out to be for the guy he can't stand in the least. And then one more, let's go to 8:15, Esther 8:15. Esther 8:15. This is after the new decree has been issued, and Mordecai goes out, Esther 8:15. Who would like that? Steve on the front row.
Then Mordecai left the king's presence, wearing a royal robe of blue and white, a great crown of gold, and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. And the people of Susa celebrated the new decree.
Okay, in your language there, people of Susa is the city of Susa. So we have now the city that was bewildered, perplexed, confused after decree number 1 is now celebrating after decree number 2 and after Mordecai's promotion here to basically everything Haman ever dreamed of. We have a change of countenance in the city because we have a change of decree in the citadel. Yes, Liz.
So back in 9:6, it says, assuming the citadel, they killed 500 men. Is that what it's saying? So like,
Right, so that's back. Right, so to bring us full circle, why did we go on that tour of citadel and city? We're saying that on the first day of fighting, the 13th day of the 12th month, that the slaughtering was happening in the citadel, the walled government part of the city, is where 500 were struck down. You're gonna.
okay, so that means
There were other people besides Haman in the citadel itself who did not like Mordecai or the Jews. Well, 500 again, and this is one of our perplexing things about Esther. We've spent some time talking about the nature of the book of Esther, and I've shared with you that majority of scholars kind of view it somewhere in the category of historical fiction, and then there are also a significant group of scholars that see it more as like a based on a true story. But even in that case, and we've talked about this, we've read it, there is some cartoonish exaggeration type of elements to the story. The author is definitely packaging things very carefully and with a sense of humor for our benefit. So there's some question with some of these numbers in Esther as to whether these are accurate technical numbers or the author is making big numbers to make a big point. Not altogether unlike, therefore, the book of Revelation, where we have a lot of symbolic numbers used to make a point. So I can't say that for sure one way or the other. You can make your own mind up on that. But by using the name 500, we're talking about a complete wipeout of the enemies that existed in the citadel.
well, even if it's not the exact number, I mean, that seems like he's trying to make the point that there's a significant amount of people.
Right. He's making the point with that number. He's making 2 points. Number one, there was no small threat in the citadel. Haman was not the only one. He had people to go along with what he wanted here. Number two, the destruction was complete. He's making both those points by describing that. But he's also making the third point, which is this happened in the citadel, which makes us wonder, well, what if anything happened in the surrounding city? And that's going to set up our next passage as well. So we focused here then in Esther 9, we are simply focusing on the citadel, the fortress area, and not only do we have 500 men, significantly we also have who else gets killed in that passage that we just... Haman's sons, Haman's 10 sons. Yes, Bill?
Well, Haman was a person with a lot of power, so he probably had his cronies within the government that was part of his ruling force that he was supporting.
Yeah.
So it kind of indicates to me that the people that were Haman's cronies were wiped out.
Right. Yes, that's a good point. So these 500 would represent Haman's cronies, as you call them, the people that would be sympathetic to Haman in different ways. We have seen that the average person in the palace does not like Haman too much because as soon as the opportunity comes up, we happen to know this great execution device right down the street, no problem, So they're all too eager to get rid of him. But he does have people who work with him. So the combined force then, Bill's pointing out here, is that Haman's affiliates in the government and Haman's family, his sons, are all taken care of here in this part of the scripture. So it's a wipeout of Haman and all who belong to him. Remember, in the ancient world especially, justice was often viewed in a corporate sense. It wasn't just about you. It was about everybody else who was connected to you. So, for example, Daniel in the lion's den, when the Lord vindicates Daniel and Daniel is brought out alive, the king is ticked off at those who conspired against Daniel and throws not just those guys in, but all their people with them, all their families with them. And to our sensibilities, that's not due process, that's not court of law, that's not their fault. But in ancient thinking, this is justice to wipe out the complete threat. The other thing that needs to be named about that is, back in 1 Samuel 15, as uncomfortable as it is to us, the command was to wipe out the Amalekites completely, to wipe out Agag and his people completely. And Saul not only refuses to do that, but he also refuses to do it so that he can keep the spoils for himself. We find actually here the reversal of both things. We find a getting done what Saul did not get done by wiping out Haman's complete people here. And then also we find a refusal to take the plunder at the end of verse 10 there. That'll be emphasized 3 times. So the Jews have had authorization, depending on how you understand the command back in chapter 8, the Jews have at least had authorization to take plunder and possibly also authorization to kill the women and children, as troubling as that is to us. But what we find here is it's the men they wiped out only, not the women and children, and they refused to take the plunder. So in the ancient context of justice here, we actually find the Jews are not being vengeful, spiteful, and going over the top for themselves. They're actually really operating more along the lines of vindication or justice and refusing to exploit the situation to their own advantage. So it is couched in those terms here. We see a reversal of where Saul failed, a refusal to gratify ourselves the way Saul did, and a complete wiping out of the threat, which is a contrast from Saul, who did not completely wipe out, and that's part of the reason we're here. So all that's going on here in these verses. Questions, comments? Yes, Bill?
But as we look at the Old Testament and the various kings that came to power over, especially in the northern kingdom of Israel, as a new king came into power, he would destroy the sons and everybody that was associated with the old king.
Yeah.
So this isn't a new type
Oh,
of
no, this is not.
situation at
Right,
all.
right.
And the few that didn't were the good kings that God brought up, and they would say, this person will die for their sins, but their children won't die because of the father's sin.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
that was identified a couple.
And that happens later on. A movement, the prophets identify a movement away from the children dying from the sons of the father to a new reality later on. The prophets will address that. But you make a great point. This is a political reality here. And, Liz and I have been reading a lot of world history with Tiffany, and all the times that, somebody comes to power and you got to knock off everybody else's sons, or even some of your own if they're a threat to your power. And so there's one level which Mordecai here is getting vindication over Haman, getting Haman's political position, and then all of the Haman-related people who could be threats to that position are also eliminated. So this is not just threats to Israel eliminated, but also threats to Haman himself, or Mordecai himself were eliminated here. All of Haman's people are
And it still goes on today.
Oh, yeah.
Communists.
Yeah. Politically, that still happens. There's a lot of places around the world where you're going to knock off your political rivals to preserve your own power. Vainly, of course. It never works, not enduringly. Only for a short time. Limited time only, but yes. Well, let's go 11 through, how far did I say here? 11 through 15, how about that? Verses 11 through 15. Liz has it, thank you.
That very day, when the king was in Nineveh, the number of the people in the fortress of Susa, he called for Queen Esther. He said, the Jews have killed 500 men in the fortress of Susa alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. If they have done that here, what has happened in the rest of the provinces? But now, what do you want? It will be granted to you. Tell me and I will do it. Esther responded, if it please the king, give the Jews of Susa permission to do again tomorrow as they have done today, and let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a pole. So the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa, and they impaled the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. Then the Jews of Susa gathered together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 more men, and again they took the plunder.
Okay, thank you, Liz, and thank you for going to the Hebrew rendering of the date there, so we don't lose that. So, the number of those slain in the citadel, meaning the fortress area, the Acropolis area, was reported to the king, and the king calls in Esther and says, hey, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, we just read that, and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel. So what's our update around the provinces? This is like your election returns coming in, what's going on abroad, and remember the way that Esther has told the story here, we got 127 provinces, ranging from the Indus River to the Nile River. So what's going on there? He repeats the same phrase in verse 12. What is your petition? What is your request? And we saw that back and forth back in Esther's banquets with the king, and in Esther's replies to the king, what is your petition? What is your request? And so there in chapters 5, 6, and 7, we had that language used before. We're not going to look this up now, but we've been through those together. So he's repeating again. He is offering again that same kind of thing up to half the kingdom. What do you want? What needs to happen? And what does Esther ask for in verse 13? What's her additional request? Really, there's two of them there. Yeah, let the 10 sons be hanged. This is where we know that hanged on the gallows really is better translated impaled on a pole. So the Hebrew text just says fixed to the wood. And as I've said, the translation that has changed over the years, depending on our frame of reference, what we assume that meant. But we have learned from research in Persian history that they love to impale people. The Romans love to crucify people. The Persians love to impale people for the same purpose. If I just want to get rid of you physically, I can kill you with a sword and we're done. But if I want to humiliate you and all the people who are affiliated with you, then I want to make a public spectacle. And so Haman was already fixed to the wood. And so now she wants his sons who have died to be fixed to the wood. There's no point in hanging somebody if they're already dead. But if we impale them and have them out there for all to see, now we've made a point of this. And again, from our standpoint, that's over the top, grotesque. From that standpoint, this is justice. This is them getting what they deserve. This is a reversal of circumstances. And so that's what she wants. And then she asks for one other thing there in verse 13. Not only the impaling of Haman's sons, what else does she ask for?
Permission to carry out the same thing.
Same thing tomorrow in Susa, meaning in the city of Susa. So day number 1, which is the day the original decrees were concerned with, both the initial authorization that Haman duped the king into giving, and now the retaliation authorization, those things were carried out in Susa, 510 as it is here, 500 men, the 10 sons of Haman. But now let that decree be carried out tomorrow in the city as well. We're going to have here an explanation as to why the Feast of Purim is celebrated on different days in different places. So this is one of the reasons that people think that the story of Esther, this version that we have here, the Masoretic text version, the Hebrew version, was written a bit later. What we have here is we have more data in this version of the story about Purim, the Feast of Purim, the observation of Purim, than what we had earlier. So we talked about we have 2 different Greek versions and a Hebrew version, and there's way more in the Hebrew version about the Feast of Purim and the dates and everything. There's no stuff. So this particular version of the account of Esther probably follows the celebration of Purim already being going on, and is explaining at this point why are there 2 different dates of the celebration. And what we're going to have here is day number 1, the original day, the work happened in Susa, the citadel, and out in the provinces. Day number 2 is in the city itself. And so we're going to have a delayed celebration for those who fight the second day. We'll read that in just a moment here. So let the Jews in Susa have this authority to take it out one more day, and let Haman's sons be hanged on gallows. So the king commanded, and the king's commanded a lot of things, hasn't he, here in this book. Another edict is issued. We've had multiple edicts already. And they took care of the sons of Haman. And the Jews come together on the 14th day of Adar, 14th day of the 12th month. So that's the next day. And they put to death in Susa how many? 300 men. But they, once again, did not lay their hands on the plunder. So we are not being like Saul. We're going to have 3 times emphasized in this chapter, we're not like Saul, we're not like Saul, we're not like Saul. We're not exploiting here. This is not for our own financial gain. This is for defending ourselves against our enemies. Let's read verses 16 through 19 then to land the plane on this part of the chapter. 16, Karen has it, 16 through 19.
Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the
Okay, thank you. So what we have here is this explanation. Apparently, the urban Jews celebrate on the 15th, and the rural Jews celebrate on the 14th. And the explanation for that is that on the initial day, the 13th, in the citadel, you have fighting going on, and way out in the provinces, you have fighting going on. And that's done so on the next day, the 14th, the people in the provinces are celebrating. But in the citadel, while you've done that work there, you need one more day. So the day after that, the 14th, they do the work in the rest of the city. And therefore, on the 15th, they have their celebration. And the key word here is rested. They had rest from their enemies, verse 17. Rested in a day of feasting and joy. So in the ancient world, what you want is rest from your enemies, rest from the chaos, so that you can carry out your purposes. So in the creation story, on the seventh day, God rests. He has defeated the waters of chaos, right? That was the Spirit hovering over the surface of the waters in the opening verses of Genesis. And so God has rest. That is told in the way an ancient king would enjoy a victory over his enemies. The ordered creation is God's victory over chaos in the ancient way of thinking. And so it is that many times throughout the Old Testament, a king has rest from his enemies. People have rest from their enemies. And that means they're done with the fighting now, and now we can live life the way it was intended to be. And so now here we have in the verses that Karen just read for us, that the Jews have rest from their enemies here, and now they can go about life in abundance. So this emphasizes, again, threat to life, threat to peace, threat to the way things ought to be. That has been taken care of now with this decree been carried out. And so now we have rest, and we can feast and have joy. And boy, oh boy, there's a lot of feasting in the book of Esther. Questions, comments, observations about any of that? You've noticed how this happens in two phases. Chapter, I guess it was 6 or 7, chapter 7, Esther made her request. My petition, my request is my people, my life and my people's lives. And then basically the king responded by, we hate Haman now, promote Mordecai. And so Esther has to go back in chapter 8 and say, hey, that's great, but I'm going to be grieved if my people die, as this decree says. So now we have the opposite decree. And then in order, we've had this vindication of Mordecai. His power, his fame grows. He is feared by the people and by the leaders. And then we have the knocking off of Haman and all of his friends and family. And so now we have rest for the people as a whole. So we got Esther and her people both have experienced God's vindication. Again, that's my word, not the text word. We're reading the theology into this. And the story has completely come full circle here. And we have resting, joy, feasting, and giving presents, verse 19, probably presents of food, which is why we will eat when we celebrate the end of this. Questions, comments? Yes, Jeff.
I would think the stage in that place would be so bad that 75,000 plus killed that the feasting would be the less than.
Right. Well, and again, so 75,000 is throughout the empire, right? He's from India to Ethiopia, Kush, Sudan today, probably. He's got a massive thing here. And again, our numbers are probably artfully rounded here for the sake of effect. But still, a lot of people have died. But a lot of this is not, a lot of this doesn't translate well because Jesus says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. The New Testament says, do not repay evil for evil or insult with insult. Do not become overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. So any of these revenge type of things, killing type of things, to us seem repugnant, and they should, because don't do this at home. If you're a follower of Christ, don't go out and knock off your enemies because you're angry at them. That's not how we're going to operate. But again, in this context, this is seen as justice. This is seen as the enemies are vanquished now, and this means we can live at rest and peace, and now we can enjoy and feast. So from their standpoint, it is cause for feasting because we were going to be eliminated without recourse. And now we've been able to defend ourselves against the great number of our active enemies. And now we can go about doing life, just like Ezekiel and Jeremiah said to do. Settle down in the places where you're planted and marry and eat and all this other stuff. And we are free to do that now because our enemy has been put to rest. So to hear this from the position of an oppressed people, of people who are far from home against their will, who are hurting at the hands of the mighty enemy, who are really defenseless to protect themselves. And now, apparently, in God's grace, one of our own has become queen, has interceded on our behalf, and now we have this opportunity to defend ourselves. To put it in that position, we were vulnerable and going to be wiped out, and now we can't be. is the explanation for the feasting and the joy and the giving of gifts of food. Other questions, comments, impressions? You can see why this story has been so meaningful to the Jewish people throughout the years. You're familiar with the history of antagonism toward that group particularly. We think most famously of World War II, but there are many other examples around the world to the present day. And so this has been such an important feast for the Jewish people throughout the years, kind of as a junior varsity version of Passover. Passover is the celebration that God intervened on our behalf to save us from the strong enemy. He did the costly thing to redeem us from death and bring us on the path to life and abundance. And he raised up a leader for us and all this other stuff. And so the child asks at the Passover meal every year, Daddy, what's the meaning of this meal? And Daddy tells them, hey, this is why we do this meal. And the whole point of the Passover celebration is by remembering that God has delivered us in the past, we celebrate that God will deliver us again. So you can see where people who've endured that kind of experience, that kind of ethnic religious persecution throughout the years, that this kind of story in the same light will be encouraging. Hey, we remember what God did for us in the days of Esther and Mordecai, and how silly our enemies ended up looking. So our imposing enemy who looked invincible has become nothing. And so we celebrate this story, anticipating that this is in fact what God will do. And we would still today believe in a day of vindication, a day of the Lord that is yet to come, when all will be judged according to what they've done, and the righteous shall live with God, and brand new bodies, no more tears, crying, mourning, pain. So all of this is in some sense an anticipation of God's final setting of all things right. And this one is just extra fun to tell with all the humor the author throws in. Yes, Tom?
So can you look at this whole book as a kind of like an undercurrent background or whatever? Here we've got Jews that are monotheistic, and now we've got the Persians that are polytheistic pagans or whatever. So the monotheists are going to, the single God, God the Father, whatever.
Right.
They're going to just sweep away, discard polytheism, paganism, and establish the monotheistic base that Christianity obviously evolved from.
Sure. Definitely we see a theological... Anytime in the Old Testament, when you see Israel being vindicated from her pagan polytheistic enemies, we see the vindication of Yahweh, the God of Israel, as the rightful Lord of heaven and earth, the God of all things, and these other gods as phonies. And so you see that here implied as well with regard to Haman and his ancestors and their practices. We see this as vindication of that.
So essentially we're saying, well, you guys just bet on the wrong horse.
Right. They have bet on the wrong horse, so to speak, and you see that. In the ancient world, you have a lot of. I say the ancient world, by the way. The ancient world is not flat. Which era, which place, the ancient world. But in general, in the ancient world, that the Israel encounters coming out of Egypt and is still dealing with here in the days of Esther, is kind of a superstitious pagan type of place, and a lot of the gods are conceived as being kind of territorial gods. So your God is God of this zone, this patch of earth, this place. And so when Yahweh does things like win battles on Mount Carmel, where Baal, that's supposed to be his place, right? And so Yahweh wins the battle there, we're saying, it turns out that home field advantage doesn't even work for Baal, that Yahweh is the true God. And so this kind of thing is implied by all of these victories that the people who serve the one true God have over against these pagans. Yeah. So it's a theological message as well. Even though, again, stunningly, and we got to ask ourselves that question, why is God not mentioned in Esther? Because we're reading him in all over the place because we've read the rest of the story and we see how this fits. But why does the author not expressly say that? Why didn't he add a line in here? This vindicates that Yahweh is God and the God of the Persians is not. Because we know that. And the Greek versions add that kind of stuff. So why is it not here? And we just don't know. Was there a question? Yes, Bill.
You mentioned the saying of Passover, and the Jews basically telling the story of what goes on in the Father's telling the story. To a great extent, shouldn't we as Christians tell the story of Easter the same way?
Exactly. Right.
We have been vindicated because of what God has done.
Absolutely.
Even greater than what God did for Israel at that time. We had even more given to us through God being the actual sacrifice.
Right.
And I
So Bill makes a good point that really Esther is the Easter. I can't stop saying the word Easter. Easter is much like Passover. The sequence of Good Friday and Easter, what Jesus has done for us, is the story that we tell. It's the key story of our deliverance. The blood of the Lamb, death passes us over, that kind of thing. And the importance of telling that story. This is one reason why we have a church calendar. I mean, we don't know what day of the week Jesus was actually born, for example, with Christmas. And we don't know exactly. We got a couple of different possible dates for the death and resurrection of Jesus. But the point is we go through that sequence every year to remind ourselves of what has happened and to give us a chance to tell the story. I think about that hymn as you were talking. I love to tell the story. For those who know it best, seem hungry and thirsty to hear it like the rest. And so there is a need to tell that story and to repeat that story. And again, just like the story of Passover did, God delivered us before, we anticipate He'll deliver us again, so also the story of Jesus. The New Testament authors see the resurrection of Jesus as clenching that He is the rightful judge, and He is the beginning of new creation, if you will, and so He is going to bring about the final verdicts of the victory that He's already won. So we look back at the resurrection of Jesus and say that clenches that our day of justice and vindication is coming. And from our non-persecuted context, for the most part, in the United States, it's harder for us to relate to this. But, I think about Liz mentioning Voice of the Martyrs earlier. The places where the Christians are really hurting to be Christian, explicitly because they're Christian. This means so much. God is a God who sees your enemies, and the end of the day will be a mockery of Haman and vindication of all the Esthers and Mordecais who choose to be faithful to the living God, regardless of the cost. This is a preview of things to come, told in the form of this story of Esther and what happened in her day. Well, we're going to read next week more than the last part of chapter 9, and then the beginning of chapter 10. We'll see how far we get. If we get through all of that next week, then the 29th will be our Feast of Purim. If we go at the speed of Bible study next week, then probably the first Wednesday of November then will become our Feast of Purim. Stay tuned. We'll keep you on edge that way. And then we got to figure out what we're going to do next. So we got a few candidates because we've had other runners up before, but we'll sort it out. Let's pray, and then we'll dismiss for today. Lord, we thank you for the gift of this story. We thank you for the ways in which you have intervened for your people in the past, most especially with your cross and your resurrection, your laying of your life down for your friends, your victory over death itself, your invitation that we would enter into life with you, your pouring out of your Spirit upon us, and your promise of a day that is coming when you will judge the living and the dead, and you'll make all things the way they ought to be and wipe all of our tears away forever. We pray that you would continue your work in us and through us by your Spirit so that people would see you through us and be filled of awe of you, that a world that doesn't fear you would fear you because of your faithful work through us and in our midst. Help us to be open to that even this day, that we would bring glory to you. And we thank you for this good discussion this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, we will see you next week for session 14 and the latter part of chapter 9.